Albert Einstein. Anybody familiar with that name? Perhaps one of the, if not the most brilliant mind of the 20th century, right? So what are the names of his 3 children? So we don't come true from seed. You got it? Einstein's children never made a splash. Just because they were the children of Einstein doesn't mean they were just as superior as he was. Once you plant a seed, you're planting an offspring. Your kids may be smarter than you are or dumber than you are. They may be taller or shorter or skinnier, but they're different from you. And the offspring of plants are different from them as well. That's why we use these methods of propagating like grafting, that we can ensure that what we get is exactly what we wanted. Well, one of the advantages of grafting is we get trees that are productive sooner. So if you plant citrus from seed, it's about 8 to 15 years before they get old enough to produce fruit. If you plant a grafted tree, you buy a grafted tree at the nursery and plant it, you're looking at 3 to 5 years. We got a little off, but I'm not sorry. All right. Some of the other terms that you will see, we've already talked about. Woody and herbaceous is in this section on page 3 and 4. There are a variety of stem modifications that you should be familiar with. These are, again, the terms of gardening, so that when somebody says node to you, you should know that that's the point on a stem where a leaf or leaves are attached. Because you may read something in a gardening book on propagation of rooting cuttings, and they may say, when taking cuttings from this plant, make your cut right below a node, so that there is a node at the bottom end of the cutting. If you don't know what a node is, you're going to be out of luck. So again, knowing the vocabulary. So node, internode, runner, crown, spur, stolen, rhizome. These are all terms that we need to be familiar with. Remember that a runner is a stem that runs along horizontally. It runs along the surface of the soil. We also use the word stolen. Runner and stolen are interchangeable. A rhizome is a horizontal stem that runs below the soil surface. So if it's a stem that runs along the surface on top of it, we call that a runner. Think about St. Augustine grass. Produces runners. If it grows below the surface, we call it a rhizome. Think about an iris rhizome growing underground. That would be a rhizome. And then we have a group of modifications of these fleshy below ground organs that we all lump into the category, we call them bulbs. Now, as you read through that information, you're going to see that what we call bulbs generically is actually some very separate types of structures. True bulbs, corms, tubers, tuberous roots, and rhizomes can all be called bulbs. And so when you walk into the nursery and say, I'm looking for your caladium bulbs, the staff might look at you, stick their nose in the air and say, oh, you mean our caladium tubers? If you said, where are your gladiolus bulbs? And they would go, oh, you mean our gladiolus corms? So there are different names for these things that we all call bulbs. And there's a reason why you all need to be familiar with some of the structural differences. Let me give you an example. You're walking through your garden in the spring with your best gardening friend, and you come upon a patch of Louisiana irises in full bloom. And your friend looks down and says, I don't have this color. That is gorgeous. I love that. I don't have that color. Now, probably before they could ask you, you would offer. Oh, well, look, I got plenty. Let me share this with you. And if you didn't say that, they would not hesitate to say, can I have some of that? Because they're your good gardening friend. So you would get a shovel, you would dig up a part of that clump of iris rhizomes, put it in a bag and give it to her. You're wandering on, you come to a nice other part of the garden, and there's an amaryllis in full bloom. Big old bright red flowers, gorgeous, just traffic-stoppingly beautiful. And your friend goes, you know, I don't have an amaryllis that looks like that. I sure would like a piece of that bulb. And you go, well, sure. So you dig up the bulb and you take a big knife and you slice that bulb in half and you give them half the bulb and you keep half the bulb. I call that the Solomon solution. Nobody gets it. Nobody gets it. You kill the bulb when you cut it in half. Do you see the difference between a true bulb and a rhizome? even though we may call them bulbs. Caladiums grow from tubers like a potato. Honestly, you could go out to a caladium right now, dig it up, and split the tuber in half. Plant each section back down in the ground and have 2 caladiums. Tubers, we split tubers up all the time. For potatoes, we cut tubers up into pieces about the size of an egg. So tubers, we cut up to propagate them. Bulbs, we don't. So again, knowing these different structures and how they're different from each other is a good thing. It is the level at which you are trying to attain your gardening knowledge. So you need to know, have a general understanding of the difference between a tuber, a true bulb, a corm, and a rhizome overall. And then finally on page 5, look for the term chilling hours. Chilling hours. Somebody says, we should be chilling. That's what they're talking about, chilling in the garden. How much time do you take to sit and just really, no, I'm just kidding. That's a good definition for chilling hours, though. How much time do you just sit back and chill in your garden and relax and appreciate what you've done? Chilling hours are actually how many hours during the winter season it is below 46 degrees. Now, y'all, plants are a lot more aware of their surroundings than you give them credit for. Here's what's going on with chilling hours. Plants that are native to cold winter climates have got to know when the winter ends and they can safely bloom and leaf out. They can't just do it based on weather, because a beautiful warm spell is going to occur in January. They're going to get tricked into leafing out too soon, and in February a killing freeze is going to come and wipe them out. So plants have got to know when the winter is ending, beyond just when that first mild spell happens to occur. And plants that are native to a particular area that have winters of a particular length develop the ability to measure the number of hours of cold they have experienced. And only when they have experienced enough hours of cold will they wake up and begin to grow. Because then they know the winter is over. They have measured the hours. They know that the average winter, I say no, you know, plants don't have a brain, but they know that the winter tends to be this particular length where they grow natively, and that's when they will wake up. If they don't get the chilling, they don't know to wake up. So plants that have adapted themselves to cold climates and have a chilling requirement, cold is not evil anymore. At that point, cold is a necessity. Cold is part of their natural life cycle, and they have to have it to grow normally. If we take plants like that and try to grow them down here with our very mild winters, they will fail. They will languish. They won't thrive because they don't get enough cold. So in particular, when you're buying fruit trees, you need to look at the chilling hours of fruit trees from temperate climates, apples, peaches, pears, and plums, and make sure you're choosing cultivars that are adapted to our mild, short winter climate. If you don't, then you'll be unsuccessful. The LSU AgCenter has excellent literature. That home orchard book has all of our recommended cultivars, so you can make sure you choose cultivars with the right chilling. Here in Baton Rouge, about 300 to 500 chilling hours is all we get. And there are apples that need 1,500 chilling hours out there or more. How many people like peonies? Oh, we can't grow them, as you know, and the reason for it is our winters are not cold enough, long enough. Peonies don't get the chilling that they need down here to grow normally, and they fade out on us. They just won't last. Now in Shreveport and Monroe, they have marginal success with peonies. Actually, they can get them to bloom up there. But for us down here, I knew a gardener one time that was determined to grow peonies, and they planted their peonies in the fall, and then every other day all through the winter they went and bought a bag of ice, and they dumped the ice on the peonies every other day, all winter long, and they came up and bloomed nicely once, and that was all they were willing to do. After that, they said, you know what, we don't live anywhere where peonies will grow well. So again, you have to decide how much you're willing to put into the work of growing your plants. That's not a lot different than running out and covering your tropicals 5 or 6 times in the wintertime when you think about it. Any questions on stems? Let's get leaves done at least before lunch. Lunch is at noon. And y'all get 2 hours for lunch? How much? An hour, 30 minutes? 30 minutes, I love it. We crack that whip, I tell you. All right, leaves. And this will be fairly straightforward and easy. Remember the two important purposes of leaves are photosynthesis, and that is the remarkable chemical reaction that plants utilize to capture the energy of light, generally sunlight, and manufacture the food they need to live and grow. And that takes place in green tissue. And transpiration is the loss of water from the leaves. And while we're talking about transpiration, this is discussed other places in your book, but let me just mention, we think of transpiration, you know, we sweat a little bit. So we sweat. We sweat to cool off. That's why we sweat, is to cool off. And we get rid of some of our waste products a little bit when we sweat as well, but mostly it's to cool off. When plants lose water vapor, it does help cool them off. So one of the effects of transpiration is, and that's the loss of water vapor from the leaves. Ever put a bag around a plant and see how the water beads up inside the bag? And that's because the leaves are constantly giving off water vapor, and it can condense on the bag. Well, the leaves are always giving off this water vapor. It does cool the leaves slightly, but the main role of transpiration is not to cool the plant. It involves the circulatory system. Transportation involves the circulatory system. Now we know that in the xylem, the liquid water is flowing upwards against the force of gravity. Now imagine an 80-foot tall pine tree. How is that pine tree moving a column of water? Have you ever held a gallon of water in your hand? Water is heavy. How is that pine tree moving moving liquid water vertically 80 feet up off the ground against the force of gravity without a pump? We have a pump. Plants don't have a heart. Well, transpiration. What happens is water molecules like to cling together. Have you ever put a drop of water on a kitchen counter? It makes a bead. The water molecules all grab each other and huddle together and make a bead. If they didn't do that, the drop of water would just spread out in one thin, even layer over the counter. So we know water holds on to each other. The water molecules like to hold on to each other. They'll latch onto each other and hold on. If we make an unbroken chain of water from the root system through the xylem, all the way up the trunk and out to the leaves, when transpiration occurs and water vapor is lost from the foliage, it pulls on that chain of water molecules. As water molecules leave the foliage, the water molecule chain is pulled on, and that pulls the water up from the ground up into the tree. So the loss of water vapor from the leaves is not just like sweating, it's part of their circulatory system. If they don't lose water from their leaves constantly, they cannot efficiently move liquids up through the xylem of their systems. So again, plants need water constantly because they have to lose water constantly. Plants just don't drink when they're thirsty. Plants don't get thirsty. They live thirsty. They're constantly drinking water because they're constantly losing water. So you understand transpiration. Think about a hurricane lamp. You got the flame at the top, that's the foliage that's transpiring. You got the wick that goes down into the lamp oil, and you got the lamp oil down in the lamp, that's the water in the soil. As the flame burns the lamp oil moves up the wick. There's no pump. It just moves up the wick because the flame draws it as it consumes the lamp oil. And that's the same way transpiration helps to pull water up through the system of the plant. Parts of a leaf. And again, it's good to know these basic, and it's not overly complicated. It's nice to know the basic parts of a leaf. The stem that connects the leaf to the main stem of the plant is called the petiole. The main part of the leaf is called the blade. Sometimes, if it has a big, prominent vein down the middle of the leaf, we call that the midrib. Not too complicated. At the base of a leaf, every leaf has a dormant bud at the base of a leaf, and it's just sort of part of the leaf structure. Wherever a leaf forms, there's going to be a dormant bud. This angle formed by the stem and the petiole is called the axis, and this little bud is called the axillary bud. That's not critical for you to remember, but you do need to remember that there are these little dormant buds at the base of leaves. Now, I do want you to understand the concept of compound leaves, and that is not every plant has a leaf blade that is all one simple unit. This is a simple leaf. Plants also make compound leaves. And here would be an example of a compound leaf. So this is the leaf blade. There are no axillary buds along the leaflets. These are called leaflets. The axillary bud is back here at the base of the leaf. If you should do this to this leaf, cut off that, what you have done is this. You've just cut off part of the leaf blade. Do y'all understand the concept of a compound leaf? This is a pinnately compound leaf. You'll see in your book there are palmately compound leaves where all the leaves join at one point, make like a hand shape or a star shape. There's a vine that we all try to avoid. How many leaflets does it have? 3. Fingers 3, leave it be. 3 leaflets. So a poison ivy leaf looks like this. This is a leaf. The bud is right back here. So again, some plants have compound leaves. You need to understand that they have leaves composed of several leaflets rather than just one blade like this. Alrighty. There are some other terms on arrangement and types of leaves that we don't need to belabor too much. I doubt if anybody's going to give you a test and have you label all the different leaf arrangements. But do be aware of some of the basics. One of the basics is how the leaves are arranged on the stem, and they may be arranged opposite, alternate, excuse me, I just said it the wrong way, alternate, opposite, or whorled. You may have several leaves coming out of one spot. And what is it called where the leaf is joined to the stem? It's called the node. The node. All right, I think, any questions on leaves? On page 9, there's a little discussion of ferns. Y'all see that? And again, because we talk about ferns in gardening, the terminology, the words that we use with ferns is important for you to be familiar with. Again, we call the leaves of ferns fronds. We call the little small immature leaves that are all rolled up. The leaves of ferns are rolled up and then gradually open up and unroll, very unique among plants. These are called croziers or fiddleheads. Crozier because they're like the shepherd's crook that the bishops carry, crozier, or fiddlehead because they look like the head of a fiddle or a violin, which is where those names come from. Remember, ferns can be evergreen or deciduous. They are typically shade preferring. And oh, don't forget, they reproduce by spores, and the spores oftentimes are on the back of the leaves. So if you have a fern frond, you may see these spots on the backs of the fronds. Sometimes they may be in a pattern, sometimes they may just be random. But those little, they're usually kind of a little bit fuzzy, round, and brown. And that's where the spores are made. Those spores will drift off and go through a little complicated life cycle and eventually create another fern. So don't be alarmed by these sporangia that you might see on the back of the fern fronds. We do have one fern. I'd like you to remember this word, epiphyte. That means upon a plant, epiphyte. And An epiphyte is a plant that grows on another plant. It's not a parasite, doesn't attack or take anything from the plant. It just sits on it, grows on it. Spanish moss is an epiphyte, just hangs on the trees, doesn't take anything from the trees. But we also have a native fern, the resurrection fern, that y'all see all along those big live oak branches. Remarkable in that when it's dry, it just shrivels up and turns brown and dead looking. You'd never believe it was alive, but the moment it rains, those dead looking fronds open up and turn brilliant green again, and it just does it over and over again. It's a remarkable plant. So we do have an epiphytic fern called the resurrection fern that prefers to grow on live oaks, but you'll find it on a variety of other kinds of trees. It's a little challenging to establish. If you pull it off the bark, you can't just set it, it's not sticky, it won't stick off. So if you try to put it on the bark, it just falls off then. So you can't really pull it off the bark. But what you can do is if a tree is being removed or if a branch falls out of a tree that has it growing on it, if you take the bark with it growing on it and if you glue that bark onto another tree, then hopefully the fern may run off of that bark and onto the trunk of the tree. Flowers. Let me just get the parts of the flowers done before lunch and we'll finish up when we come back. So the flowers, despite our relationship with flowers, which is interesting. Plants don't make flowers for us. There's no real reason why we should be interested in flowers at all. I mean, there's nothing about them that is good for a human. We don't need to know when plants are blooming or anything. We eat the fruit, not the flowers. So it's really odd that we derive pleasure from flowers, but it's really no more odd than deriving pleasure from a beautiful sunset. We're just odd creatures. We just like the things we like. And one of the things we like are flowers. We like the colors, the shapes, the fragrances when they're there, but they're not meant for us. They're not decorative. They're not decorative. Flowers are not decorative. Flowers are serious for the plant. Plants aren't just blooming because they're happy and they want to make the world a nicer place. This is a serious effort to reproduce themselves. Plants bloom to continue on their species. It's how they continue their species. It's how they reproduce sexually. So flowers are serious for plants, at least in nature. Now, once we get a hold of them, flowers become something else altogether. But in nature, remember, flowers are not an accessory. Flowers are not made to brighten the world. If they're colorful to attract particular pollinators, and the color is meant to attract that particular pollinator. If they're fragrant, that fragrance is not meant to perfume the air. It's meant to pull in particular pollinators. It's a deadly serious business of reproduction. If they can't reproduce properly in the wild, they go extinct. So flowers are the means that plants have of reproducing themselves sexually. Flowers are the sex organs of the plants that we grow. And flowers are intimately involved in sexual reproduction. Now, let's look at the basic parts of a flower. You don't have to remember this, but the little stem that connects the flower to the plant is called the peduncle. That's just a neat word, peduncle. You could call somebody that. You're such a peduncle, and they have no idea what you're talking about. It's just a little stem, and then this swollen area is called the receptacle, and this is where all of the parts of the flower are attached to the receptacle. And where they are attached is definite. And the first attachment, the lowest attachment to the receptacle, are the sepals, or calyx. If they're fused together, it's called a calyx, the sepals. Sepals are oftentimes green and leafy. Think about a rosebud, that green leafy covering that covers the bud and then opens up and you see the petals. Those are the sepals of the rosebud. And for many plants, the sepals are a protective covering that protects the flower bud before it opens. In hydrangeas, however, the sepals have been modified. And those 4 big petals that you see in a hydrangea head for each flower, those are sepals. Those are modified sepals that actually look like petals. How do they know? Because of where they're attached to the receptacle. The next part of the flower that's attached, the next highest up, is the petal. Petals, or petal. If they're all fused together like in a morning glory flower, it's called a corolla. If they're individual, they're called petals. And again, the petals can be showy, colorful. They're meant to attract pollinators. They're landing pod for pollinators. Some plants have flowers that have petals that are so conformed that they force the insect to go in one certain way and force it to back out one certain way to ensure pollination. Snapdragons are like that. What's pollinating a snapdragon? Bumblebees. Bumblebees are the only insect big enough to push the lip down on the snapdragon and force its way inside, and the flower is designed specifically to exclude everybody else except for the bumblebees that have just the right size body to pollinate their flowers. So petals are not superfluous. They're not showy to make us happy. They're not just decoration. They are deadly serious for these plants' ability to reproduce themselves. Now we come to these sex organs. The sepals and petals are not part of the sexual part of the flower. The sexual part of the male and female organs. And the male organ is called the anther. Or stamen. I don't know why stamen wouldn't come to mind. Stamen. The anther or stamen. The female part of the flower is called the pistil. Now the pistil, did I spell that right? I always put the E in the wrong place. I always put down the gun. I don't know why that is. Pistil. And that's this whole structure. But it's subdivided into the stigma. There's a swollen, sticky end up here called the stigma. Then there's a tube-like structure called the style. And then this large area down here is the ovary. And inside the ovary are the eggs, the female eggs. So, how does sexual reproduction take place in plants? Well, the stamen produces pollen grains, and these pollen grains contain the male nucleus. This is the sperm of the plant. The pollen contains the male nucleus. The pollen gets transferred to the stigma by one way or the other, wind, insects, whatever's doing it. And once the pollen grain lands on the stigma, the pollen grain grows a tube. And the tube grows down through the style and into the ovary, and the tube then connects up with one of the ovules or eggs. Down this tube is delivered the male nucleus that fuses with the egg nucleus to create a new embryo, a new little plant. And every one of these eggs, if it gets fertilized, turns into a separate seed. So the result of fertilizing the egg is the formation of a seed. The seed is formed by the fertilization of the egg. The ovary that surrounds the seeds becomes the fruit of the flowering plant. So the fruit of a plant is just the mature ovary which encloses the seeds. So for flowering plants, botanically, anything that encloses the seeds is called a fruit. Now we use the word fruit in a culinary sense for what we eat. Or when we use the word fruit, we're using it like a food use, not like a botany use. In botany, anything that encloses the seeds is a fruit. An acorn is a fruit. A tomato is a fruit. A snap bean is a fruit. Squash is a fruit. Anything that has seeds inside of it is the fruit, botanically. So if you called me up and said, I have spots on my tomatoes, what should I do? First question I have to ask you is, are the spots on the leaves or the fruit?